Hello. So I am currently reading four stupidly long books for the March of the Mammoths readathon, and I thought I'd make a quick video to let you know about how things are going so far. I also hope if you are joining in and reading a mammoth-sized book yourself in the month of March that you'll join us for some discussions in the comments down below, because I'm always curious about how week one goes. I feel like it's kind of an important week because it sets the tone for the whole month. On one hand, you have all of this energy and enthusiasm because you're just starting this reading project. Your endurance doesn't really need to kick in yet for making it through your mammoth-sized book. But at the same time, getting into some really long novels can also be a bit of a challenge because usually the pacing is a bit slower and it might be a wider cast of characters. So I always find starting Mammoths takes a lot more intention and focus than it does for me to sometimes finish them, where I'm happy to just read a bunch of pages in one sitting. I also like that week one of this readathon is a bit of a reality check because if you're anything like me, I really like to get carried away in my imagination about how much I'm going to be able to read. And then life happens. And in week one, I can really see what is realistic and manageable for me to read. And this week for me, I've made pretty good progress. I'm not reading as much as I need to be reading to get through 5 books. Still, I've made a valiant effort. So I have read 930 pages so far. So that in itself would be one mammoth-sized book, but I have spaced it out over the course of 4 books. But if you, like me, are falling a bit behind in your reading goals, I have an exciting announcement to make. Based on some of the feedback I was getting from my TBR video, it seems like there are a few of you who might be interested in joining me for a kind of casual 24 in 48 hour readathon for this upcoming weekend, March 12th, which is a Saturday, through to March 13th on a Sunday. So the goal for this readathon is to really try to read as much as you can over the course of one weekend. Obviously, reading for 24 hours on any given weekend is a huge luxury, so there's totally no pressure to participate for the full time amount or anything, but I just wanted to let you know that that was happening if that would help you feel a bit more motivated with getting some reading done this weekend. I'm fortunate enough to be heading into my March break vacation, so I'm going to give it my best shot and really try to make up for some of the progress that I wasn't able to make in week one. The book that I've made the most progress with so far is Kristin, Lavransdatter. I'm 350 pages in, although most of that progress happened over the course of the weekend when I was able to stay up longer at night, because I found this to be a really difficult book to put down once I got going. And I'm rereading this book, but I also have a notoriously poor memory, so I had kind of remembered like the emotions that are explored in this book, but I really forgot that there were a lot more exciting plot points than I remembered. So if you're worried about picking this up because you think that this huge novel of historical fiction set in medieval Norway is going to be a dull reading experience, well, let me tell you, it's not. The medieval times are very dramatic because, first of all, the characters are quite highly religious, which puts this moral intensity onto all of their actions. Because, of course, as human beings, they are tempted to sin, but they just really have to wrestle with the consequences of their actions more than perhaps more modern characters might have to. And there's also a lot of gory moments in this book as well that I forgot about. People are really whipping their swords out, getting into fights, coughing up blood. There's just a lot more action than I remembered happening before. But also, this book is just an emotionally devastating look at the parent-child relationship, especially as children become teenagers, they grow up, they start making their own choices, you can't really stop them. So this book, I feel like, did a really great job of showing the sorrow that comes with those kind of familial bonds, even in families that are really close, where there's lots of love, but there can still be these devastating moments that you can't really stop. So I'm truly enjoying my reread of this book, and I mentioned that my memory is terrible, and I really don't know what's coming up next in books 2 and book 3. Like, I know the plague is going to show up at one point, but there's still a lot of things that I'm hazy about, so really enjoying this one so far. The other book that I'm surprisingly loving is The Best Poems of the English Language by Harold Bloom. I'm on page 250 of this book. I'm just getting to Alexander Pope, meaning I'm in the 1700s in terms of the poetry that I'm reading. And I have to say, I kind of went into this one thinking that the beginning of this book, the kind of early period poetry, was going to be a bit of a chore, but I have to say, I had the most surprising and exhilarating experience of my life when I read Chaucer for the first time in Middle English. Something that I like about this anthology is that Harold Bloom will provide these introductions to the poets before you get into their works. And let's be real, he's a very knowledgeable scholar for sure, but he's also quite opinionated, and that can be a bit of a hit or miss experience. But one thing that he strongly asserted before we got into the Chaucer section is that you do not need to read a translation for Chaucer. He believes that everyone should read Chaucer in the original Middle English because he feels like if you translate it, you lose all of the beautiful poetry of his words, and he says that it's actually not that difficult. And see, that is something that I never knew for myself. So I tried reading a translation of the Canterbury Tales, and I could not get into it. But then I tried reading Chaucer in the original, and I had the greatest of times. So that has been my mistake all along, and I can't tell you how excited I am after I finish this collection to dive into the Canterbury Tales, like for real, the original version, because the language is like so strange, but it's strange in this like hilarious, joyful way. It's kind of seeing these words again for the first time, and the sheer musicality of the early English language is just breathtaking to behold. That has been my true joy and discovery in this collection so far. So I've really liked a lot of these early poets. So far, my three favorite poets that I have encountered in this collection have been Chaucer, Shakespeare, and Milton, which is a really basic opinion because everyone agrees that those are kind of like the three best poets ever in the English language. But there's something about getting to read poets by other contemporaries of these three that sort of makes you understand why they're so great and so special, because I've been trying to read the poems aloud in here to truly appreciate how they sound. And like when you're reading Shakespeare or Milton, like you feel like you're performing some kind of magical incantation. There is something that is just on the next level about how beautiful those words sound coming out of your mouth and moving into your ear. So I have to say, this one is surprising me. I am loving it, and I'm getting closer to the era of the Romantic poets, which I think will also be fun. So that's kind of my plan for this weekend, is to power through those Romantic poets. I'm also enjoying everything else that I'm reading. I won't gush as much about it as I have with these first two books, but the Pessoa biography is going well so far. I'm also around 250 pages into this book, and it's pretty thorough, as you might expect for a 900-page biography. At this point in the book, Pessoa is like 19 years old, so we have really spent a lot of time discussing his youth and adolescence. And so far, the most interesting topic by far is the appearance of his heteronyms, these fully created consciousnesses or characters that Pessoa would use to attribute different pieces of his writing to. And something that I'm learning in here is that the heteronyms appear quite early on in his life. So it's definitely something that comes naturally to who he is and how his imagination works. So it was very fascinating to see him operate in high school, where he's creating these whole newspapers, but he and his personas are creating every section of this paper and writing all the different columns. So it's been a quite fascinating book. I'm reminded heavily of the Bronte sisters and the kind of rich imaginary world that they created together, which the author gets into a bit, but he kind of reminds us that the Brontes at least had each other to kind of feed off of and to work with to create these imaginative realms. But Pessoa didn't grow up with siblings that were really close to him in age, so it's also quite fascinating to see how he has that same kind of impulsive drive to create the same way that the Brontes do, but without having that network of support to encourage it as well. So fascinating book so far, and I'm curious to see where he's going to go now that he has reached more of a young adult stage in his life. And then lastly, the book that I have made the least amount of progress with is the Foresight Saga by John Galsworthy. I'm only on about page 75 of this one, and this is the book that I'm feeling like I'm not going to be able to finish it in the month of March, and I've already made peace with that, because this long book is only volume 1 in a series that has 3 volumes, so it's not like I'd be finishing the whole thing this month anyway, so I'm okay if this ends up spilling over into another month. That is fine with me. This book also took a lot of time to get into, as I will show you. It has a huge family tree to work your way through. And the first scene in this novel is a party where the whole family is getting together. So Galsworthy just introduces you to so many characters at once that it was very overwhelming, and I had to read the first 20 pages over again a second time to make sense of what was happening, because we're dealing with a family that has like 9 siblings, and each of those siblings has their own branch of the family, and there's just a lot going on. But I have found my footing, and I'm figuring out who the kind of main characters of the drama are going to be, so it's definitely getting easier as I continue. I'm enjoying this one, but I'm not like loving it. I'm not desperate to go back and pick this one up every day. I'm finding it fine, but I will say, like, this book is very ironic in its portrayal of this upper middle class family near the turn of the century. And on one hand, that's what makes this book very funny and amusing, because John Galsworthy kind of sets it up that you expect that the characters are going to say one thing and then they end up doing something else, which makes them appear very petty by comparison. For example, there's one scene where this father and son have this reunion. They haven't talked to each other for this really long time, and they finally sit down and have this conversation. And you think it's going to be this emotional moment, and it's really not. So here's how that passage goes. In his turn, old Julian looked back at his son. He wanted to talk about many things that he had been unable to talk about all these years. It had been impossible to seriously confide to June his conviction that property in the Soho quarter would go up in value, his uneasiness about that tremendous silence of Pippin, the superintendent of the new colliery company, of which he had so long been chairman, his disgust at the steady fall in American Golgothas, or even to discuss how, by some sort of settlement, he could best avoid the payment of those death duties which would follow his disease. So, like, examples like that are really funny when the book just completely kind of skewers the characters and their priorities. But on the other hand, I do feel like this irony kind of keeps the characters away at a distance, because they're sort of figures of ridicule. I'm not sure that I'm fully emotionally invested in their stories. So I think that's what's preventing me from feeling like a real urgency to wanting to read this book. So I'm curious to continue forward, but it is probably my least favorite right now out of the 4 Mammoths that I'm reading. So that's it for my week 1 update of March of the Mammoths 2022. Please let me know how it's going for you down below in the comments, and I hope you'll consider joining in for our extra reading time scheduled this weekend for the 24 in 48 hour readathon. See ya!